Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to today's kitchen session live lecture, which today is called New Old Things or Old New Things, Rethinking Novelty for a Greener Christmas. And it's going to be delivered by Dr. Rebecca Collins, who's a senior lecturer in human geography here at the University of Chester. So I'll be passing over to Rebecca shortly. My name's Anna, I'm an HE advisor here at the university, and I'm here with my colleagues Zazel and Gavin, who are behind the scenes, and they're going to be taking a look at some of your questions as they come in. So firstly, just to reassure everyone who's watching that your audio and video isn't going to be shared during this session, but you can definitely get involved if you'd like to ask questions, and you can do that using the chat function on the right hand side of your screen. And you can choose to be anonymous if you want to, just by ticking the box. So we'll save up all your questions for after Rebecca's session, and then Zazel will put those to Rebecca. You can like other people's questions if there's something you also want to know the answer to, and if you need to, you can also respond back to Rebecca's answers at the end. So I think that's everything from me, and I'm going to hand over to Rebecca now.
Thanks, Anna, and hi everyone. My name is Rebecca Collins. As Anna said, I'm a senior lecturer in human geography. And my main interests in both my teaching and research are the geographies of our everyday material stuff. Our clothes, our food, our tech, where it comes from, how it shapes our lives, and ultimately, the thing I'm most interested in is where is it going? So, for example, with our first year students, I look at things like the economic and cultural geographies of our everyday stuff. And that involves considering the impacts of production on livelihoods in different parts of the world, how feasible it is for people to earn a living, for example, but also how and why material things are important for helping us understand and communicate who we are. And this is what we mean when we talk about material culture, which is a term I'm going to come back to later. In second year, we look at how global networks of production intersect with geopolitics. And here we look at how competition to access and control the flow of natural resources, of which all of these things are made, like oil and minerals and water, isn't just about economic gains, it's also a means of countries seeking to exert power over one another and on the global political stage. Underpinning all of this is my interest in sustainability, how we can live comfortable lives while reducing the significant and growing burden that we place on our natural environment. This is what my research focuses on. And it's also what I teach at third year in a module called Sustainable Futures. But in this kitchen session, or probably more appropriately sofa session, because that's where I am, I'm going to talk about how some of these economic, political and cultural geographies collide, presenting us with both sustainability challenges, but also sustainability opportunities. And I'm going to do that through the very topical lens of Christmas festivities. Now, Christmas this year is inevitably going to be very different thanks to COVID, and that means we're inevitably going to be doing a lot quite differently this year from perhaps the way we might normally celebrate Christmas. But this is an opportunity for us to create new rituals, new ways of doing things that we might decide in some ways are better than what went before. Now, since the start of the pandemic in the UK back in the spring, I've been researching with my colleague, Dr. Catherine Welsh, and our team, how the changes to much of our everyday consumption that's been driven by COVID has been creating opportunities for what you might have heard described, if you listen to the news, as a green recovery. So we've been looking specifically at the scale of individuals and households. How have the limitations on our everyday mobility, on what we can buy and how we can buy it, and what we can spend our time doing, how have these changes made our old routines defunct and forced us to create new ones? More specifically, we've been trying to find out in what areas of our everyday consumption people have been embracing new habits that are, by some measure, greener than their old habits. And as we shift in and out of lockdowns and fire breaks and systems of tiers, which of these newer, maybe greener habits look like they might stick over the longer term? So before I go any further, I should just clarify what I mean by habits in this kind of context. I mean things like shifting towards buying from more local suppliers for things like milk, veg. If you're a meat eater, you might be buying meat from a local butcher. So this is about a relocalisation of economic geographies. You might be staying close to home for safety, but in doing that, you might also be lending greater support to local businesses and therefore local economies. Another example might concern what we wear. A lot of us, myself included, have been dressing quite differently because our working patterns and our spaces of work have changed. I'm currently working from my sofa. For many people, this has meant that our clothing requirements have changed and often reduced. And so we're buying less new clothing because we're content to keep wearing what we might otherwise have described as old clothing for longer. And I've done old with the bunny fingers for a reason, because I'm going to come back to this idea of old a little bit later. But broadly, this whole point is about reducing unnecessary waste, another really important aspect of sustainable everyday living. So in sum, what we're finding out in this kind of lockdown living project is that a lot of people consumed differently under lockdown. And although these changes were not driven primarily or even at all by a desire to reduce their environmental impacts, in some instances, those environmental impacts might have been reduced accidentally. This is what we call inadvertent environmentalism. Now, many months later, as we approach Christmas, some people are trying to maintain those new habits that they developed under lockdown because they perceive them as somehow better than what they were doing before. Now, whether they see them as better environmentally or better in other ways is sort of a moot point. For example, someone might see the fact that they now get a doorstop milk delivery as better because it supports a local farmer, so it's good for the local economy. But it also reduces plastic waste because it uses glass bottles that can be recycled. But now it's Christmas, and a lot of rules go out of the window at Christmas because at times of festivity and celebration, we don't want to be constrained by rules or values that for the other 51 weeks of the year we abide by, whether willingly or maybe sometimes begrudgingly. So this COVID Christmas is going to be a real test of lots of things in lots of ways. Now, I want to acknowledge that many people have been moving towards having a greener Christmas for a long time, and some people have always had a green Christmas. But for others, 2020 might have been a catalyst year, precisely because of the way in which the pandemic has demanded such large-scale changes to so many aspects of our lives, whether that has been because of the limitations on our movements or because of changing economic circumstances, for example. So are those people who have intentionally sought to embrace greener consumption habits as a result of lockdowns, are they going to be able to maintain those over the next few weeks? If so, how are they going to do that? And these are some of the questions that Catherine and I and our research team are going to be asking in the next phase of our research early in 2021. But it's not going to be easy, not least because of the challenges that 2020 has brought, which means that many people are keener than ever for a sense of joy and fun and togetherness. Which is why, when I was thinking about what to talk about in this sofa session, I thought I'd try to bridge the gap between this idea of green recovery and these green shoots of recovery that are emerging from these lockdown-induced habit changes, and the fact that Christmas 2020 is necessarily going to be different, which in and of itself can present opportunities. So I'm going to share a few thoughts as to how we can create that sense of delight at Christmas in ways that don't cost the earth and that recognise that despite the significant challenges 2020 has brought, there are some ways in which we might take it as a much needed reset for our consumption heavy lifestyles. So in doing this, I'm going to draw on another research project I've been working on over the last few years, which focuses specifically on the concept of novelty. And all of a sudden, hopefully you're seeing the link to this talk's title. Now, novelty is a pretty big Christmas theme, given its link to the gift-giving aspect of the festive season. And at this point, I would like to pause and ask you to just reflect on a few questions. And I will pause just for a few seconds in between the questions because I genuinely do want you to think about this. So the first question for you: do you like new things? Now, if you're asking yourself, well, what do you mean by new? Then that's great. You're thinking like a social scientist and you're clearly a human geographer in the making. It's up to you to define what new means for you. If you do like new things, however you define new, why do you like them? What is it that they offer that makes them attractive or enticing? Is it that they create a sense of curiosity? Is it about the discovery? Is it about the sensory aspect? Is it the way they feel or smell or sound? Does it give you a sense of joining in with a particular style? Is it about fulfilling some kind of social expectation? Access to part of a group? Is it about peer admiration? There are lots of different dimensions to this attractiveness of novelty. So let me ask you another question. How long does the buzz of novelty last? Is it a few days? A few weeks? A few hours? Maybe it depends on the object in question. And then what? How soon is it before you need a new thing to regain that buzz? Now, novelty, which ultimately is the distinctiveness of something that is new to us, can be a really fun, exciting and joyful thing. And it's a key part of what Christmas is about, whether we're opening presents, playing games with loved ones, eating differently from what we eat throughout the rest of the year. I mean, even pulling a Christmas cracker to see what's inside it. But within the consumer culture that we in the UK inhabit, we tend to see novelty too often as something that we buy, that we enjoy for as long as that buzz of newness lasts, and then we replace. Because doing so is easy, it's convenient. We can literally do it with the tap of an app. And because very effective social media influencers and advertisers tell us that is what everyone else is doing. And this is particularly the case in two main sectors that a lot of you will have very direct experience of, and that's clothing and the consumer technologies that we're all staring at right now. So phones, gaming consoles, laptops, tablets, that sort of thing. But it's our willingness to buy into this form of novelty that is literally costing us the earth. It's not about not having these things, it is the frequency with which we are invited to buy a new one of lots of these things. And these processes are using up resources that are finite. And with a growing global population wanting to achieve the same quality of life as we enjoy here in the UK, which should be open to everyone, competition to access these finite resources is leading to conflict, it's perpetuating existing socioeconomic inequalities, and it's resulting in irreparable environmental damage. So over the last few years, I've been thinking about alternative ways of producing novelty, such that we can still enjoy that excitement, but without the significant environmental, social and geopolitical impacts that require the use, or sorry, that result from demanding the use of virgin materials with every new purchase. So I'm going to tell you some of the things that I've been thinking about, and then I'm going to suggest how, should you want to, you might apply some of these ideas yourself for a greener Christmas, either this year or in the future. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is this relationship between new and old. And the inverted commas are important. So when I asked you a few minutes ago whether you like new things, I hope some of you thought, well, what do you mean by new? Because we can think of new as a relative term. It can refer to what we might call brand new, which is made from virgin materials. The materials have never been used before. The object itself has never been used before. But it can also mean something that is new to you, but that object, prior to becoming yours, had a prior life, and we can describe it as a life. Within human geography and allied disciplines like anthropology, it's very common to describe inanimate objects as having a life or a biography, that they move through the world and experience different contexts in the same way that we as human beings do. So new can in fact sometimes mean old. If any of you have ever bought anything secondhand, you'll know exactly what I mean. The object, whether it's a jacket or a phone, is new to you, and you can enjoy the delight of novelty by getting to know that thing, but that thing has already had a life. Its biography started before it came into your possession. And many would argue that that history adds a form of value to the objects. That's entirely what antiques are premised on. That's a very extreme example, but it's exactly the same idea. From a sustainable consumption point of view, this is a really important conceptual and practical point, because we need to keep our material things in use for longer. So being able to find novelty in things that are now sometimes described as pre-loved, somehow that makes them sound more attractive. This is a really crucial, and it's a very accessible way of us taking action. The second thing I've been thinking about is perhaps more overtly geographical, and that's about the place of things in a very literal sense. I'm talking about the placing of material things in our homes. Now, you might not be used to thinking about geography at what we call the micro scale, the scale of individual lived experience, or at the meso scale, which is the scale of the household. But for me, these are the geographical scales that interest me most, because no matter what happens at a global level, in terms of trade in minerals or geopolitical conflict over oil and gas, the impacts of those global processes are played out through you and me, through the material things that we can access, and in turn, how that impacts our lives. So the mundane material things that surround us that we take for granted, sofa that I'm sat on, things that we barely even notice, we're so used to seeing them, are, as far as I'm concerned, these are all important geopolitical and geoeconomic objects. And for that reason, every single one of them has a role to play in our ability or our willingness to live more sustainably. So at the micro and meso scales, we can create novelty just by moving things around. And I think some of you might have already experienced this under lockdown. Have any of you moved furniture around to create work zones, for example, in your homes? Have you changed the use of something to fulfill a practical need? In one of my previous studies, one of my participants put her shoes in her bookcase and her books in her wardrobe, just because she wanted to create a sense of change in her living environment. And it made as much sense to her to organise her things that way as it did the other way around. So that stimulatory dimension of novelty can be achieved just as easily by moving things around as it can be by adding something new to your environment. The thing that's different is that something has changed. You don't have to add something new to create that sense of change. And this can be achieved with things like clothing as well. Just wearing something in a new context or styled in a different way achieves the same end, distinctiveness, a sense of change, but without any additional financial or environmental cost. And the third way I've been prompted to think about novelty is in terms of hide and seek, which is a game I imagine a lot of you are familiar with. A really easy way of producing a sense of novelty for yourself, if you have the means to do so, is through storage. Storage, you say, doesn't sound very exciting. It doesn't, does it? I know, but that's partly the point. So many of the things that we can do are incredibly mundane, but that doesn't mean they aren't important, and it doesn't mean they aren't impactful. Often they are all the more important and impactful because we have the means to do them every day. Anyway, back to storage and this game of hide and seek. How many of you have ever pulled something out of the back of your wardrobe or out of the loft and gone, I've completely forgotten I had that? You might have been prompted to think about the times that you'd used or worn that thing. You might have enjoyed a moment of nostalgia, and then you've brought that thing back into use. You've started to add to its biography. All of a sudden, that thing becomes interesting again, something worthy of rediscovery, because it had quite literally been out of sight and out of mind for such a long time. If something's stored away for long enough, it might even be classified as vintage by the time it's brought back into use. And if that's the case, then there are all kinds of additional forms of cultural value that might be attributed to that thing. Styling something as vintage, regardless of its actual age, applies a form of cultural status or cachet that all of a sudden makes that thing more desirable. So again, this game of hide and seek, just by using the forms of storage, the spaces of your domestic environment, is another accessible means of producing a sense of novelty without the need to buy something new. So what might this look like at Christmas? More specifically, a COVID Christmas, where we are tired of every day feeling the same and we're desperate for the kind of stimulation that a bit of novelty can bring. So first of all, let's go back to this fuzzy relationship between concepts of old and new. Now, depending on your interests, some of the Christmas gifts that you might be giving this year might already have been upcycled. They might be things that you've made yourself. They might be things that you have bought that have been upcycled. And upcycling is, of course, one of the most widely known ways of blurring this boundary between old and new. It makes something old both new and appealing, such that we very frequently give such things as gifts. And that touch of the handmade is seen as, again, an additional form of value that makes that thing desirable. But beyond upcycling, where else is there scope to embrace something old as something new? Whether it's in the context of the gifts that you give or the gifts that you might hope to receive, in the decorations that you put up, where can you find novelty in material things that already have a life? And how might you add to that object's biography such that in giving or using something old, you're adding value to it, rather than simply accepting the view that in the context of everyday material culture, old means loss of value. And by way of example, homemade Christmas pudding was previously a sock. And of course, being a geographer, I like to make things out of maps. So, star maps. Probably only appealing if you're an enthusiastic amateur maker like I am. What about this idea of place and this idea of changing the context, moving things around, using things for different purposes? Especially if you aren't able to get together with the people you might have been hoping to see this Christmas, what can you do to create a sense of novelty wherever you're going to be? I mean, I wonder to what extent this has already happened when people started to move furniture around to accommodate a Christmas tree, for example. How might you replace as opposed to replace? Think about that. I'll say it again. How might you replace as opposed to replace things that you've started to take for granted because they're hidden in plain sight? Maybe there's even scope to gamify this form of novelty. Challenge your friends to wear old things in new ways to your Christmas Zoom quiz or your socially distanced meetup with your family, for example. And then how about this game of hide and seek? Well, you've probably all been playing it. Take the long view and just think for a moment about your Christmas decorations. Hide and seek with your stuff is pretty much just treating more things like your Christmas decorations. We put these things away every year, completely forgetting about them for 11 months before we get the annual delight of finding our favourite decoration to place in a prime spot on the tree. This year has been a challenging one, no doubt about it, in so many different ways. But one thing it has given us is a solid nudge to make us think about how and why we consume in the ways that we do. And it's given us a timely opportunity to make a change for perhaps a greener new year, and one that I think we all hope will be healthier for human beings and healthier for the planet. So stay safe, everyone, and have a happy Christmas.
Oh, thank you very much, Rebecca. This is Zazel here. I'm just going to ask you a few questions. On our chat, we had a bit of love for your stars made out of maths.
Great.
It'd be nice to know. Are they like little origami stars or?
Yeah, they are. They're made of Ordnance Survey maps. Of course, they would be, being a geographer. And yeah, they're just origami. I just found the pattern on the internet.
Oh, lovely. Ah. Where are they of? Where was the map of?
That's a great question. I made them a few years ago, and I made a lot for friends, and I can't remember which ones I ended up with, but the maps were all of places that were of personal importance to me. So they might be of where I live now, which is in Flintshire, or they might have been where I grew up, which is Cheshire East, or it might have been where I lived for a long time, which was Cambridge. So it'll be probably one of those three places.
Okay. Yeah, somebody else says that's so true about the decorations. It's always such fun remembering when we bought them and the Christmases past. I think actually, for some people, they keep the decorations from, family members, and Christmas decorations do very much hold a kind of a sort of a real sort of cherishment, I suppose, to them. And as you say, you get them out once a year, and you go through the box, and you remember all sorts of things. So yeah.
I think they're really sorry.
No, go on.
I think the other thing that I think makes Christmas decorations a really nice example is actually the point that you've just made. They're things that we can enjoy the novelty of year on year, but the biographies of these objects is really profound, because you might have ones that have been gifted to you, you might have picked them up from various different places. So even thinking, I don't have a traditional Christmas tree, I've just got branches in my living room, and I've got things on there that have been gifted to me by so many friends, and some of them I'd forgotten about because I only see them once a year. So there are so many different biographies of these things that we get from Christmas decorations, and this is something that we can get from all of our stuff all year. We just have to think of things maybe more like Christmas decorations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got another question here. So how can we shift cultural norms to accept old as new when it comes to gifting and giving, when so many place value on the brand new?
Oh, any question about cultural norms is a huge one. I mean, we could be here all night talking about how to shift cultural norms. Yeah, how do we shift towards an acceptance of the old, especially in the context of gift giving? I think this shift is starting to happen, and I think it's starting to happen more in the context of the garment industry and clothing and textiles, because I think textiles is one of those fields where the material form itself can look very attractive as it ages. Like leather is the prime example of this. As a leather jacket ages, or as a leather sofa ages, those things are deemed to be more attractive. And there are other forms of kind of textile wear. Denim is another example where that aging is deemed to be desirable. So I think a lot of this hinges on the aesthetics that are that surround a lot of these material objects. So what I think needs to happen, and I actually talked about this in my TEDx talk earlier this term, is that we need to find ways of valuing these material aesthetics differently. So we like aged denim and we like aged leather. What we don't like is aged wool. We don't like pilled wool. That is seen as a really kind of aging thing in a garment. So what creates this shift? Unfortunately, it's often kind of people at the top of the power hierarchy in these industries. And the challenge that I threw down in my TEDx talk was if there's a social media influencer, an Insta influencer out there that wants to start posting about how brilliant it is to wear a pilled jumper, that would create a significant change. We can work on that from the ground up. I'm very proud of my bobbly jumpers, but if a social media influencer all of a sudden started wearing pilled knitwear, I'd be fascinated to see what happened.
It would be very interesting. Maybe it might come out of one of the fashion houses. You never know, but that would be brand new.
But look at what happened with Brit denim. Denim is a really hard wearing fabric, and high street stores sell new garments from virgin fabric that are made to look old, and people buy them. So there is a market for an old aesthetic, and people are willingly to buy that new. So why do we not value things that are organically old? And this is only part of an answer to the question that was asked around cultural norms. There are so many different dimensions to that. But for me, a really big one is these ideas about the aesthetics of materials. Phones is another one. There's some absolutely fascinating research done by the design school at Loughborough, where I'm just going to grab my phone, where the phone casing, they made lots of different phone casings from cork, from leather, from a whole range of materials. And they looked at how these materials aged, and they sort of formed through wide-ranging research kind of aesthetic judgments about how these things looked and therefore how attractive they were as the materials age. Now plastic gets scuffed and it gets chipped and it looks old very easily, but they found that the leather cases became more desirable the older they looked. So there's really something in this material aesthetic bit that is one of the things that I find most fascinating.
Yeah, I think, I've thought in the past myself about buying what would have been brand new, an expensive item, but if I could get it secondhand, then that would be an ideal gift for someone. Normally, for me, it's things like toys for children in the family. But I'm never sure how that is going to be received in terms of a second-hand item that's being given at Christmas or for a birthday, because you know, I have this sort of perceived notion that people want something that is brand new. And I don't know how I can get over that way of thinking, really. Have you got any tips for me?
I think a tip really is just to be brave, because the only way that cultural norms shift is if people start doing them. Someone has got to start to create that shift, and it probably invites an opportunity for a conversation. I think the other way of thinking about it is that it's, you know, and there are adverts on TV at the moment that are sort of taking the mick out of this idea of getting gifts that you don't really want, that you're going to re-gift anyway. So the idea of receiving a gift that isn't really what you're looking for already happens. So, and I acknowledge that's a slightly different issue, but this idea of uncomfortableness around the giving and receiving of gifts is kind of a slightly separate cultural issue. And that's perhaps to do with different sets of expectations around gifting. But I think if you want to be part of this shift towards a growing acceptance of reuse, whether it's, you know, toys, books, clothes, whatever, then join the crew of people who are already doing it. And those people are there. We just don't see them because there aren't as many of them. Yeah, someone's got to be the instigator. Someone's got to drive the change. Drive the change, Zazel.
Right, next question. Do you have any tips for gifting in a greener way?
Gifting in a greener way. I think first of all, you've got to think about what you mean by gift. We're definitely thinking a material thing, because gifts don't have to be material things. What I'm doing in my family this year, my sister and I have done charity donations this year. Gifting, obviously, this Christmas is particularly challenging because of COVID. Spending time and spending experiences with people is always an alternative to material thing. But if you're keen on material things, I guess the main thing to consider is what you want to gift, or is what you intend to gift really wanted, and is it going to be used? Is it going to be valued? Or is it a gift for the sake of gifting? Because, again, looping back to my earlier point, there's a lot of stuff that changes hands at Christmas that is a gift for the sake of gifting. And we all like to give. We like to demonstrate our generosity and on our thought for people. But we have to, I think, try and balance that with the enormous amount of environmental impact that goes along with it. And that's not to be a killjoy, because there are other ways of gifting. Making things, if you enjoy that process, and I acknowledge not everyone does. But I think the main thing is to think, is what you are going to gift going to be used and appreciated and valued?
Okay. So for you, in terms of your interest then in novelty, where does that kind of concept come from?
Yeah, my interest in novelty came from the persistent trend for jeans with pre-ripped knees and the persistence of this trend. And it's just something that I found fascinating. The idea that people will spend money on a new garment that is made to look old, and yet other garments that are become old naturally, including denim, are hugely devalued, such that we are sending hundreds of thousands of tons of textile waste to landfill in the UK every year, far more so than pretty much other countries in Europe. So it was that fascination, really, and I wanted to really therefore understand this tension between oldness and newness in a whole range of contexts, but particularly in clothing consumption. So that was really where it started, and it was from there that I developed this interest in kind of the aesthetics of sustainable consumption. How important is it how something looks to make us want to change the way we consume something, whether it's consuming less of something or consuming a different type of something. And there has been some research into this area that has looked particularly at food and the aesthetics of organic veg or veg box schemes, and the fact that getting muddy carrots is quite unappealing to many consumers. They don't want to have to put in the extra work to clean the carrots before they peel them. So while this aesthetic interest can on one level seem quite frivolous, oh well, why does it matter what it looks like? Well, actually it really does matter what it looks like, because it can make a really big difference to someone's willingness or not to engage with an opportunity to consume differently. So that was really where the novelty thing started. It was with the jeans, and it sort of kept going from there. I'm not done with novelty yet.
I think my idea of novelty, which you've kind of challenged a little bit here, is novelty to me is something that is maybe a bit gimmicky in a way. So it's very short-lived. Yeah, a gimmick. Christmas epitomizes novelty. You know, in our family, we own a Sprout hat. That to me is novelty. How do we kind of get over this idea of these very short-lived kind of gains? You know, is there anything that we can do to elongate that novelty in a way?
I think there are a number of things that your question touches on, and one of them is sort of to do with attention span. You know, how long do we want to be entertained for by something? How long are we willing to be interested in something? And this goes far beyond our material consumption, although that's part of it. This idea of kind of gimmicky, this gimmicky take on novelty is arguably something that underpins the whole fast fashion industry, because it's something that you buy, you wear once, perhaps to make a particular statement, and then you're done with it. So that's, we could apply that framing to that field. Arguably, we can also apply it to tech. You know, how different is this version of the iPhone to that version of the iPhone really? And if anyone wants to explore that idea some more, there's some great Jimmy Kimmel clips on YouTube that really illustrate how gullible we are as consumers in terms of the gimmicks that we are sold as being the reason to buy a new smartphone. But the idea of attention span is one that goes so far beyond our consumption. I think our attention spans as human beings have been compromised in lots of ways by forms of consumer culture, whether it's to do with fashion, whether it's to do with the media information that we consume. Is it in 280 characters, or if it's more than that, or it's a bit too much for me, really? So there's a much bigger cultural project there around attention spans and how we might value all sorts of things longer. Well, fortunately for the Sprout hat, somebody wears it at least once every year. That's great news. And hopefully there's a thrill of novelty every time it's unpacked out of a box.
Yeah, I think there is. I think that's all for the questions for today. We've had no new ones through on our chat there. I'm just slowing down a little bit just in case somebody's writing one, but I don't think there's anything coming through. But what I'll do now is I'll hand back over to Anna, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zazel, and thank you very much to Rebecca. That was a really interesting and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you very much, and I hope everyone enjoyed it at home. We're going to put it on our website as well if you missed any of it. And just to let you know, there's going to be lots more lectures coming up this week and into January as well, so do join us, and you can book those online through our website. Thank you very much for watching. Cheers, bye-bye.